Late October in the Absaroka Range. Frost crystallizes on sagebrush in the gray half-light before dawn, each stem glazed white and brittle. And across the high meadows of northwestern Wyoming, the remains of hunting season lie scattered like offerings. Elk carcasses, gutted, abandoned, half-consumed, dot the clearings where rifle reports echoed only days before. The hunters have gone home, but something else has moved in to collect what they left behind. This is the season of hyperphagia, a biological countdown that begins in late summer and accelerates through autumn, driving grizzly bears into a feeding frenzy that borders on compulsion. A mature boar, 900 pounds of muscle, fat, and appetite, can consume more than 20,000 calories a day during this phase. It is not hunger in any way humans understand the word. It is a metabolic imperative, a body preparing to shut down for months of hibernation, packing on the fat reserves that will mean the difference between waking in spring and not waking at all. Every calorie matters. Every meal is defended. And that defense has a name. Wildlife biologists call it resource guarding. When a grizzly claims a carcass, it does not simply feed and move on. It buries the remains under mounds of dirt, pine duff, and torn vegetation. It beds down nearby. And it treats anything that approaches, wolf, coyote, another bear, a human, as a direct competitor for a resource it cannot afford to lose. This is not the bluff charge that hikers read about in trailhead pamphlets, the explosive burst meant to intimidate without contact. Resource guarding produces something different entirely. The bear commits. It closes distance with intent. But before we get to how Game & Fish ultimately handled Grizzly A12's relocation and what Dale had to say about it, if this kind of detailed breakdown is what you come to YouTube for, not the sensationalized version, but the actual behavioral forensics, the cache dynamics, the management protocols, do me a favor and hit subscribe. And if you're already subscribed, that like button genuinely helps these videos reach people who appreciate this level of detail. All right, back to Meeteetse and what Dale told local media after those 3 months of recovery. Biologists who study grizzly aggression identify it as one of the most predictable triggers for a violent, sustained attack. The variables are simple: a bear, a carcass, and anything foolish or unlucky enough to walk between them. In the foothills outside Meeteetse, Wyoming, those variables were converging on a morning that started like any other. Dale Heaton was 63 years old, a third-generation rancher whose family had worked cattle in this country since his grandfather first drove a herd up the Graybull River drainage. Dale knew these foothills the way a man knows the hallways of the house he grew up in. Every draw, every ridgeline, every stretch of fence. He had seen grizzly sign before, tracks in the mud along irrigation ditches, overturned rocks where bears had dug for ground squirrels. He understood the risks. He respected them. But familiarity has a way of softening the edges of danger, of turning caution into routine. That morning, Dale had noticed a section of fence down on the eastern boundary of his grazing allotment. Downed fence meant stray cattle, and stray cattle in October meant animals wandering into country where they did not belong. Higher ground, thicker timber, terrain that belonged to something other than livestock. He saddled his horse before the sun cleared the ridgeline and rode out along a creekbed trail he had followed hundreds of times. The air was cold and still. The only sound was hooves on loose rock and the occasional crack of ice in the shallows. 2 miles from the ranch house, the horse stopped. Not slowed, stopped. Its ears pinned forward, nostrils flaring, muscles locked rigid beneath the saddle. Dale knew horses. He knew what a balking animal looked like when it sensed something a rider could not. He spoke to it, pressed his heels. The horse would not move. Dale dismounted. He dropped the reins and walked ahead on foot, scanning the creek bed and the willow thickets that pressed in on both sides. Within 40 yards, he smelled it. Heavy, sweet, unmistakable. The thick stench of decomposing flesh carried on air too cold to disperse it. And then he saw the mound. Dirt and pine duff and torn grass heaped over a shape that was clearly an animal. A cow elk, partially buried, partially consumed. A classic grizzly cache. Dale stopped. He understood exactly what he was looking at. He understood what it meant. He turned to walk back toward his horse, but the willow to his left was already moving. 15 feet away, a shape separated from the dense tangle of branches, enormous, dark, and closing the distance before Dale's hand ever reached the canister of bear spray on his belt. The stench of cached elk hangs thick in the cold air. Dale Heaton stands 40 yards from his horse, and a 570-pound grizzly is already closing the distance from a willow thicket 15 feet to his left. There is no time to think. There is barely time to react. The bear strikes before Dale can reach the canister of bear spray on his belt. 570 pounds of muscle and bone, driven by the singular imperative to defend what it has claimed. The impact is not a push, it is a demolition. Dale is lifted off his feet and driven backward into the rocky creek bed, his boots scraping uselessly against wet stone as the ground comes up to meet him. He does what decades of living in bear country have trained him to do. He curls into the defensive posture, face down, hands locked behind his neck. This is not instinct. Instinct tells you to fight, to run, to scream. This is discipline. The position works because it protects what matters most: the spine, the jugular, the back of the skull. It tucks the face against the earth, shields the neck with forearms and interlocked fingers, and presents the broadest, least vulnerable surface of the body, the back, to the animal's jaws. It also communicates something to the bear, however faintly. A motionless, prone figure is not behaving like a competitor. It is not fighting for the carcass. In the calculus of a grizzly defending a kill, a non-threat can be dismissed. But dismissed does not mean ignored, not immediately. The bear bites into Dale's upper back. Its canines punch through the canvas jacket and into his shoulder blade, the pressure immense, the sound a wet, grinding crunch that Dale would remember long after the pain faded. Then the claws. They rake across his right arm and down his rib cage, tearing fabric, skin, and muscle in ragged lines. Dale presses his face into the gravel of the creek bed and does not move, does not cry out. The creek bed that had been his familiar trail for decades is now a place where seconds stretch into something unrecognizable. The mauling lasts roughly 30 to 45 seconds. Dale would later describe it as feeling like minutes. Then the weight lifts. The bear does not flee. It does not retreat into the willows. It turns and walks back to the cached elk carcass, stands over the mound of dirt and torn grass, and resumes its position, huffing and popping its jaws. This is resource guarding in its most elemental form. The threat approached. The threat was neutralized. The bear returns to what it was protecting. The equation, from the grizzly's perspective, is resolved. From Dale's perspective, nothing is resolved. He lies face down in the creek bed, blood soaking through his jacket, pooling against the stones beneath him. He can hear the bear feeding, the wet tearing of flesh, the crack of small bones, the occasional low grunt, all of it yards away, close enough that any movement, any sound, could restart the entire sequence. So he does not move. He lies still, and he listens, and the minutes pass with a weight that no clock can measure. When he finally begins to move, it is slow, agonizingly slow. Dale crawls down the creek bed, pulling himself forward with his uninjured left arm, dragging his right side over the rocks. Every motion sends fire through his ribs and back. His horse had bolted roughly 200 yards east when the attack began, and those 200 yards might as well be 2 miles. It takes him nearly 20 minutes to cover that distance. 20 minutes of gravel under his palms, of stopping to listen, of willing his breathing to stay shallow and quiet. The horse is standing in a clearing, sides still trembling, reins tangled in low brush. Dale reaches up with his left hand, grips the saddle horn, and hauls himself up. The effort nearly blacks him out, but he gets there. He gets into the saddle, and he rides. Back at the ranch, his wife takes one look at him and calls 911.
A helicopter from Cody Regional Health arrives and transports Dale to Billings, Montana, where a surgical team is waiting. The damage is extensive. Lacerations to the trapezius muscle, a fractured scapula, deep puncture wounds to the right forearm, 4 broken ribs. The inventory of injuries reads like a catalog of what a grizzly's jaws and claws can do in under a minute. Dale Heaton is alive. He is airlifted out of the foothills and into an operating room 2 states away. But back along that creek bed, in the frost and the fading autumn light, the grizzly that mauled him is still standing over its cache, still guarding what it claimed. And Wyoming Game and Fish now has a decision to make about a bear they already know by number.
Within hours of Dale Heaton's helicopter lifting off from his ranch, a Wyoming Game and Fish team is already on the ground at the attack site, working the creek bed where his blood is still drying on the rocks. The first thing they confirm is what Dale already knew. The cached elk carcass is exactly where he found it, mounded over with dirt, pine duff, and torn grass, the unmistakable signature of a grizzly defending a food source. This was the trigger. Not surprise, not territorial aggression, not a sow protecting cubs. A bear on a kill, treating a human being as a competitor for calories it could not afford to lose. The team moves outward from the cache, documenting tracks, scat, and drag marks in the soft ground along the creek. Then they find something on the barbed wire fence line at the eastern boundary of the grazing allotment. Coarse brown hair snagged on a barb. They collect the samples and send them to the State Wildlife Forensics Lab. The results come back quickly. The hair belongs to a bear already in the database, Grizzly 812, a mature male first tagged in 2019 near the Shoshone National Forest boundary. A known animal, documented, tracked, and now confirmed as the bear that put a 63-year-old rancher in a trauma helicopter. What happens next is not simple. Under the Interagency Grizzly Bear Management Protocol, a bear that attacks a human while defending a food cache in a remote area is not automatically destroyed. The calculus is more deliberate than that. Managers weigh proximity to human activity, the likelihood of repeat encounters, and whether the bear's behavior falls within the range of what biologists would call a natural defensive response. A grizzly guarding a cached carcass in the backcountry is doing exactly what its biology dictates. That does not make the victim's injuries less severe, but it does shape the decision. Game and Fish sets a culvert trap near the elk cache. The logic is straightforward. A bear in hyperphagia will return to a food source until every usable calorie is consumed. 3 days later, Grizzly 812 walks into the trap. He is sedated, fitted with a fresh GPS collar, and loaded into a transport trailer. The destination is deep in the Teton Wilderness, roughly 60 miles from the nearest ranch. Remote enough, managers hope, to break the pattern. Whether relocation holds for a bear with a 60-mile ranging radius during peak feeding season is a question no one answers with certainty. Dale Heaton, meanwhile, is in a hospital bed in Billings, Montana. Surgeons have repaired the lacerations to his trapezius, stabilized a fractured scapula, closed deep puncture wounds in his right forearm, and treated 4 broken ribs. 11 days in the hospital. Then 3 months of physical therapy before he can swing a leg over a saddle again. When local media reaches him for comment, Dale says something that stays with you. He does not blame the bear. His words are precise. I walked into its living room. No anger, no call for the animal's destruction. A man who has lived alongside grizzly country for 3 generations, who understands the contract that comes with working land at the edge of wilderness. He walked into its living room, and the bear responded the only way a bear on a kill knows how. But Dale has changed his protocol. He carries both bear spray and a sidearm on every ride now, and he never approaches a downed fence alone. Not anymore. Here is where one man's story becomes something larger. Wyoming Game and Fish recorded 7 confirmed grizzly-human conflicts in that same autumn season. 7. And 4 of those 7 were tied directly to resource guarding behavior over cached carcasses. The same trigger, the same behavioral pattern, the same collision between a bear doing what evolution demands and a human being in the wrong 40 yards of creek bed. This is the reality that wildlife managers have been warning about for years.
Grizzly populations in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem have been a recovery success story. Numbers climbing, range expanding, bears pushing into foothills and river corridors where they haven't been seen in generations. But expansion means contact. And contact, during hyperphagia, over a cached carcass, produces exactly the kind of encounter that nearly killed Dale Heaton. These encounters are no longer exceptional. They are the new baseline. The foothills of the Absaroka Range still look the way they have always looked. Frost on the sagebrush, elk moving through the high meadows, creekbed trails winding through willow and cottonwood. And somewhere in that landscape, a bear with a GPS collar and a number, 812, is feeding, caching, defending. The range is only getting wider.